Welcome back to Silent Screams, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of fear and the unexplained. In today's video, we're stepping into the world of real horror stories, the kind that will make you question the very nature of reality. These chilling stories have been shared by my subscribers, and I promise you, they are not for the faint of heart. So, sit back, turn off the lights, and brace yourself for a night filled with terror. Let's begin. It all started with a seemingly ordinary submission. It was from a subscriber who goes by the name of Alex. At first glance, it appeared like just another ghost story, the kind we've all heard before. But as Alex began recounting the details, something felt off, like the words were drenched in something much darker, something that couldn't be explained away by logic or science. Alex described a house, his childhood home, a large, creaky old building that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't anything unusual by itself, just an old house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But Alex's experiences there were anything but ordinary. He recalled how, as a child, he would often hear whispers at night. Soft voices, too quiet to make out, just on the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was his parents talking, or maybe the house settling, but then the whispers began to feel more deliberate. One night, Alex was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was silent, except for the usual creaks and groans that old buildings make when the wind hits just right. But then, the whispers started. Only this time, they were louder, more distinct. Alex could make out a few words, just barely, but the most chilling part was the language. It wasn't any language he recognized. It sounded ancient, like something out of a nightmare. He got up, heart pounding in his chest, and crept down the hallway toward the sound. As he approached the living room, he felt a cold draft rush past him, sending a chill up his spine. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, the room seemed unnaturally dark. The curtains were drawn, but there was no reason for it to feel so cold. The whispers were louder now, echoing around the room as though the walls themselves were speaking. Alex said he could feel something in the room, something that wasn't human. Something that had been there far longer than he ever could have imagined. He stumbled back, terrified, and as he did, he noticed something else, a shadow moving against the far wall, stretching impossibly long and thin, even though there was no light source. The shadow moved in a way that no human could. It didn't walk or crawl, it just shifted, like it was floating. Frozen with fear, Alex couldn't tear his eyes away. The shadow seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, breathing. The whispers turned into laughter, high-pitched and unsettling, like 100 voices speaking in unison. Alex felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He turned to run but was frozen in place, as though an unseen force had grabbed him and held him there. Just when he thought he would pass out from sheer terror, the door slammed shut behind him, breaking the grip the shadow had on him. Alex bolted out of the room, his heart racing. From that night forward, the whispers didn't stop. They followed him everywhere, at school, at his friend's house, even when he was alone in the bathroom. The voice would find him. And it wasn't just the whispers anymore. Sometimes, he would catch glimpses of a figure in the corner of his eye, a fleeting image of something tall, dark, and impossibly thin, standing just beyond his sight. Years passed, but the haunting didn't end. Alex eventually moved out of his childhood home, hoping that distance would put an end to the terror. But the whispers followed him, and so did the shadow. He tried to ignore it, to move on with his life, but no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. One evening, when Alex was in his mid-20s, he received an unexpected message. It was from a woman named Sarah, a psychic who claimed to have sensed his presence for years. She said that the entity haunting him wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something much older, something that had been attached to his family long before he was born. The entity was bound to the house, and as long as he lived in proximity to it, the whispers would continue. Desperate for answers, Alex reached out to Sarah. They arranged a meeting, and she came to his new apartment. Sarah brought with her a set of candles, crystals, and a book that seemed older than anything Alex had ever seen. The book was covered in symbols he couldn't understand, and it gave off a faint, unsettling glow when she opened it. As Sarah began chanting in an ancient language, the temperature in the room dropped. Alex could see his breath in the air, and he could feel the weight of something dark pressing against him. The whispers started again, but this time, they weren't distant. They were right next to him, in his ear, as if the entity was standing right behind him. Sarah kept chanting, oblivious to the terror creeping up on Alex. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and in the silence, Alex felt something cold and heavy press against his back. His heart raced, and before he could react, a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. It wasn't the whispers anymore. It was a voice, deep, demonic, and unmistakable. "I've been waiting for you," the voice growled. Alex spun around, but there was nothing there. The room remained empty, but the air was thick with malevolence. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow, the entity, was right there with him, watching, waiting. Sarah continued her incantations, but Alex could sense the struggle. The room felt alive with energy, pulsing in time with the whispers. Then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The room went quiet, the temperature returned to normal, and the lights flickered back on. Sarah stood there, exhausted but calm. She looked at Alex with a knowing expression, as if she had been expecting this all along. "The entity is stronger than I thought," she said quietly. "It's not just after you, Alex. It's after everything you love." He left that day with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the entity was not done with him yet. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and Alex knew in his bones that it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him, body and soul. But there was something else, something he couldn't explain. A new feeling that started to creep up on him, an overwhelming sense of being followed, hunted even. It was as if the very air around him had changed, becoming thicker with every passing day. The next few months were filled with strange occurrences. Items would go missing, only to turn up in the most bizarre places. He would wake up to find his front door open, even though he was sure he had locked it the night before. And sometimes, when he looked into the mirror, he would catch a glimpse of something behind him, a figure standing just out of reach, but always just out of sight. It wasn't until one night, when Alex found himself sitting alone in his living room, that the true horror revealed itself. As he stared into the darkness, he heard a sound, a tap, 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 coming from the wall. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but then the sound came again, louder this time, more urgent. Then came the scratching. A sharp, frantic scraping against the wood. His heart skipped a beat. He slowly stood up and walked toward the wall. The scratching continued, and with every step he took, the sound grew louder. He reached the wall, pressed his ear against it, and waited for a moment of silence. The scratching stopped, but only for a brief moment. And then, just as he pulled away from the wall, he saw it. A hand, pale, bony, and skeletal, reached out from behind the drywall. Alex stumbled back, falling to the floor in shock. The hand withdrew, and the wall shifted, as if something was trying to break through. The air turned cold again, and the whispers began anew. But this time, they weren't distant. They were right behind him, so close he could feel their breath on his neck. He knew then that there was no escaping it. No matter where he went, No matter how far he ran, the shadow would always follow. And this was just the beginning. Alex lay there, frozen on the floor, his mind racing as the whispers began to crescendo around him. His body felt as though it were made of stone, too heavy to move, too paralyzed by fear to react. The coldness in the air seeped into his bones, leaving him shivering uncontrollably. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing along with him, suffocating him with its eerie presence. The hand behind the wall had disappeared, but Alex knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment. The room seemed to close in on him. His breath was shallow, his vision blurring at the edges. As his eyes darted to the corner of the room, he thought he saw something move, just a flicker of motion, too fast to catch with certainty. But when he blinked, it was gone. Alex had learned long ago not to trust his eyes when the supernatural was involved. His every instinct screamed at him to get up, to run, but the cold, paralyzing dread gripped him harder than ever before. The whispers, now unmistakably clear, began to chant a phrase over and over. "You cannot escape." The words echoed through the room, swirling in his ears like a broken record, repeating themselves until they began to distort, until Alex could no longer tell where they were coming from. Were they from the walls? The floor? The very air around him? He could feel them creeping inside his mind, gnawing at his sanity, feeding on his fear. He stumbled to his feet, shaking uncontrollably. The room around him had changed. The walls seemed to stretch and bend in impossible angles, the shadows growing longer, as if the darkness itself were alive. The flickering lights overhead only added to the disorientation, casting everything in an unsettling, pulsing glow. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and for a moment, Alex wondered if he had slipped into another dimension, one where the laws of reality no longer applied. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it again. The shadow. A thin, elongated figure standing in the farthest corner of the room. It wasn't moving, but Alex could feel it watching him. It was like a black stain on the air itself, a distortion that refused to be ignored. The figure was impossible to comprehend, shifting in and out of focus, its form constantly warping and stretching, as if it were trying to break free from the very fabric of reality. Before he could process what he was seeing, the temperature in the room plummeted. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a smell that Alex couldn't quite identify, a rotten, decayed scent, like something long dead had been disturbed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath became visible in the icy air. He turned toward the door, but it was no use. The shadows had grown so thick that the doorway was nothing but a faint outline, a crack in the darkness. Then, the whispers turned into laughter. It was high-pitched, guttural, and filled with malice. The sound vibrated in his skull, making his teeth ache. The laughter was not human, nor was it anything remotely close to the natural world. It was twisted, cruel, and ancient, as though it had been waiting for centuries to finally be unleashed. The shadow in the corner seemed to grow in size with each burst of laughter, its outline growing sharper, more defined. Alex could feel its presence now, pressing down on him, suffocating him with its evil. He took a step backward, his mind spinning, and that's when he heard it, soft footsteps, like the shuffle of someone dragging their feet across the floor behind him. His heart lurched in his chest, but when he turned, there was nothing there. No figure, no presence, just the empty space he had been staring at for so long. But then he felt something cold brushing against the back of his neck. His breath caught in his throat, his skin prickling with the sensation of invisible fingers touching him. He spun around. But once again, there was nothing. Only the empty air. Except now, the shadow in the corner was gone. It didn't vanish, it simply moved. Slowly, deliberately, like it was toying with him. Alex could feel the change in the air, the way the temperature shifted and the shadows warped in its wake. He couldn't tell where it had gone, but he knew it wasn't far. The very walls seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic hum, like a heartbeat, and the floor beneath his feet creaked as though something was shifting underneath. Then, out of nowhere, the floorboards beneath him gave way. Alex screamed as the wood splintered beneath his feet, and he fell through, crashing into a dark abyss below. The world around him twisted as he tumbled, his limbs flailing in the darkness, his mind spinning. He reached out, trying to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The fall felt endless, and he was sure he would be lost forever, swallowed by the void. Suddenly, the world stopped. His body slammed into something cold and hard, knocking the air from his lungs. He gasped, trying to catch his breath, but when he opened his eyes, everything was still dark. But this darkness was different. It wasn't the shadowy gloom of his apartment, it was absolute, suffocating darkness. No walls, no floor, no light. Just an endless, all-consuming blackness that stretched out infinitely in every direction. His pulse raced in his ears as he tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, weighted down by the oppressive atmosphere. He was dizzy, disoriented, and the whispers had returned, now louder than ever. They swirled around him, coming from every direction, but there was no source. No voice. Just the sound of thousands of murmurs, too low to make out any individual words, but all carrying the same menacing tone. The air felt thick and humid, like he was drowning in it. He reached out with trembling hands, but there was nothing to grab. And then, through the suffocating darkness, he saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a dying candle. He squinted, trying to focus, his heart pounding in his chest. The light wasn't steady. It flickered, moving as if it were being carried by an unseen hand. And then it stopped. For a moment, there was silence. The whispers had died down, leaving an unsettling calm hanging in the air. But Alex didn't dare breathe a sigh of relief. He could feel it, the presence. The shadow, the entity, whatever it was near. Without thinking, he began to move toward the light, his legs shaky beneath him, each step feeling like an eternity. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to it, as though it were his only escape. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing more of the space around him. The walls, if you could even call them that, were pulsating with dark energy, rippling like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. And then, suddenly, the light flared. It grew brighter, blinding Alex, until he had to shield his eyes. When he opened them again, he was no longer alone. The figure was standing there, just beyond the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a mere silhouette against the glowing backdrop. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless mask that seemed to absorb the light around it. Alex could feel its presence more than he could see it, its malice, its hunger, its desire to torment. But what terrified him most wasn't the figure itself. It was the way it moved. Slowly, almost languidly, it tilted its head to the side, as though studying him, as though deciding how best to approach its prey. Alex wanted to run, but his legs were frozen, his body too weak to obey his mind. His heart beat faster, each thud louder than the last, each beat sending a shock of terror through his veins. Then, without warning, the figure raised its arm. The movement was so sudden that Alex didn't have time to react. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something invisible had struck him, knocking the breath out of him. His vision blurred, and the whispers grew louder again, filling his ears with a cacophony of distorted sounds, until everything was drowned out by one single word: run. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a plea. It was a command, a demand from the darkness itself. The voice, though faint, was clear, and it chilled him to the core. Alex couldn't understand it, couldn't comprehend what was happening, but he knew, deep down, that he had no choice. He turned and ran. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and with every step, the space around him distorted, as though the world itself was fighting back. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. His feet pounded against the ground, his breath ragged and uneven, but it didn't matter. The shadow was close. He could feel it. And as he ran, Alex couldn't help but wonder, was there anywhere he could hide from the darkness? Or was this just the beginning of a nightmare that would never end?